Welcome to this explainer. Look, every pilot certificate comes with some pretty incredible privileges, the things you're legally allowed to do in the sky. But honestly, equally important are your limitations, the lines you absolutely cannot cross. Today, we're diving deep into FAA regulations to protect your hard-earned pilot certificate by clearly mapping the boundaries of what you can and, just as importantly, what you cannot do. Whether you're a student pilot prepping for that big check ride or a newly minted private pilot trying to navigate the real-world rules of compensation, knowing these lines inside and out is absolutely essential. Okay, let's jump right in. We'll be using a boundary box framework today as we quickly cover student pilot limits, the private default rule, business and expenses, specialized exceptions, and finally, how to protect your certificate. All right, starting off with Section 1, Student Limitations, which is all about operating in a highly controlled solo environment. Any check ride examiner is going to want to see you nail this fundamental contrast right out of the gates. Student solo flight is a highly controlled environment. It is stripped back to the bare basics, no passengers, and absolutely no money changing hands. Now, in contrast, while private pilots have significantly more freedom, like the ability to actually carry passengers for personal travel, a private certificate is definitely not a commercial license. This brilliantly illustrates the big picture here. As a student pilot, your privileges are limited. You're soloing only when properly endorsed. Once you're a private pilot, you get broader privileges, right? You're authorized for passenger carry and personal transportation. But look closely at that warning in the middle. Both of these certificates exist within strict regulatory boundaries. Upgrading to a private pilot certificate does not suddenly grant you commercial authority. Let's see how this builds for students specifically. Under CFR Part 61.89, the boundary box for a student pilot is incredibly tight. There's a total, flat-out prohibition on carrying passengers, carrying property for compensation, or flying in furtherance of a business. You're also boxed in by strict visibility minimums. You need at least 3 statute miles during the day and 5 at night, all while maintaining visual reference to the surface. And here's a big one. You must comply with every single limitation your authorized instructor writes in your logbook. If your CFI writes no solo above 8 knots crosswind, well, that's not just advice. That becomes a strict legal limitation for you. Moving on to Section 2, the private default rule. Let's talk about the strict no compensation rule. This right here is the fundamental rule that traps a lot of pilots. It's found in Section 61.113. Read it carefully. A private pilot generally may not act as pilot in command for compensation or hire. Essentially, unless you hold a specific legally defined key, you cannot accept money, reimbursement, or really any economic benefit at all to fly. However, Section 61.113 isn't a completely sealed vault. It actually provides exactly 7 specific, narrow doors out of that restricted box. Incidental business, pro-rata expense sharing, search and location operations, aircraft sales, demonstrations, glider towing, charitable events, and production flight testing. But, and this is absolutely crucial, an exception is not blanket permission. If you want to walk through one of those doors, you have to meet all the conditions of that specific exception. Miss even one condition, the default prohibition applies, and your flight becomes illegal. Which brings us to the big question. Literally, the million-dollar question. Every private pilot inevitably asks when friends, family, or businesses get involved, can I accept money for this flight? Let's dig into that in Section 3, Business and Expenses, specifically focusing on when money actually starts changing hands. So the FAA draws a very clear line between what is incidental and what is a service. Imagine you're a real estate agent. If you fly yourself to another city to inspect a property, that is completely legal. Your business is real estate, not flying airplanes, right? The flight is just how you got to work. But if you decide to fly a client or a coworker to that property in exchange for compensation, well, now that's an illegal passenger transport operation. You simply cannot use the incidental business exception to transport other people. Then we have pro-rata expense sharing. Aviation fuel isn't cheap, we all know that, but the math here is incredibly rigid. You can only share costs for fuel, oil, airport expenditures, and aircraft rental fees, period. Let's say a flight's permitted expenses total $300, and there are 3 people aboard, you and 2 passengers. You must pay at least your equal pro-rata share. In this case, that's $100. You cannot shift your required share onto your passengers to score a free flight, and you absolutely cannot use expense sharing to turn a profit. But hey, it isn't just about the math. You also need what the FAA calls a genuine common purpose.
You have to have an independent reason for making the trip. If you were already planning to fly down to Key West for a classic $100 hamburger and a friend wants to tag along and share the fuel cost, that's perfectly fine. But if a stranger at the FBO asks you to fly them to Key West because they just need a ride and they offer to pay their share, that is a hard no. There is no common purpose there. That's just an air taxi service. Furthermore, you can't hold out or advertise your services to the public.
Okay, Section 4, Special Exceptions. These come with some seriously rigorous thresholds. Take aircraft sales, for instance. If you want to demonstrate an aircraft in flight to a prospective buyer, you need at least 200 hours of logged flight time. But here's the kicker. You must also actually be an aircraft salesperson. Simply having 200 hours under your belt doesn't give you permission to fly people around for compensation under the guise of an aircraft demonstration.
Next up, if you want to act as pilot in command for a charitable, nonprofit, or community event flight, that experience requirement jumps way up. You need a minimum of 500 hours of flight time just to act as PIC for those flights. And for those charitable flights under Part 91-146, the compliance checklist is massive and absolute. It's a tightly controlled operation. The flight has to be nonstop, beginning and ending at the exact same airport, and remaining within a 25 statute-mile radius. It must be conducted during the day under visual flight rules with no aerobatics and no formation flying. The aircraft itself is capped at a maximum of 30 passenger seats and a 7,500-pound payload capacity. Plus, there are strict limits on how many events an organization can even hold per year, and you have to notify the FAA at least 7 days in advance.
Similarly, towing a glider or unpowered ultralight vehicle under Section 61.69 isn't just about grabbing a quick logbook endorsement from your buddy. It's a rigid, step-by-step ladder. You have to meet applicable certificate requirements, log specific PIC experience, receive dedicated training and an endorsement, and maintain strict recent experience towing currency. Rounding out the specialized exceptions, we've got search and location operations and light sport aircraft production testing. You can actually be reimbursed for direct operating expenses like fuel and oil in a sanctioned search and location operation, as long as it's under the control of a qualifying agency. Also, there's a very narrow exception that allows private pilots to conduct production flight testing of powered parachutes or weight shift control light sport aircraft, provided they have at least 100 hours of PIC time in that specific category and class. Finally, Section 5, Protecting Your Certificate. Let's talk about staying within your limits. Think of this decision tree as your ultimate cheat sheet. If you're ever offered money, reimbursement, or literally any economic benefit for a flight, just trace your way through this logic. Start at the top. Are you receiving money or benefit? If yes, does this flight fall under a specific 61.113 exception? If it doesn't, stop right there. It's an unauthorized, illegal commercial operation. If you think an exception does apply, you have to confirm you meet all the conditions of that specific door, whether it's pro-rata sharing, incidental business, or a charity event. Always remember this fundamental truth. Your pilot certificate gives you privileges, but those privileges always exist inside a regulatory boundary. Crossing that boundary doesn't just mean a slap on the wrist. It compromises the safety of your passengers, it invalidates your operational legality, and it puts your license in serious jeopardy. Bottom line, if you are ever unsure whether a flight meets every single condition for compensation or expense sharing, the only safe and legal action is to stay on the ground. Don't guess, consult the regulations directly, or reach out to a certified flight instructor. Seriously, it is so much better to ask a question on the ground than to face a full-blown FAA investigation after you land. So I want to leave you with this to chew on before you head to the hangar. Take a look at your upcoming weekend flying plans. Are you absolutely certain that your shared expenses with that new acquaintance or your incidental business trip with a client on board aren't secretly crossing the line into an illegal commercial operation? Know your boundaries, fly safe, and protect your certificate. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.